Hi again. So in the last video, we talked about the early emergence of the automobile and how it really instigated in a sense, a fight for space within the urban context. Cars needed space in order to move quickly, in order to improve their safety records so that they weren't, having crashes with pedestrians, etc. And so this really starts a trend in transportation planning towards physical separation between different modes. Perhaps lanes for traffic and then sidewalks and crosswalks for pedestrians that sort of keep them in their place, and then train tracks perhaps for a streetcar. This philosophy of physical separation and of creating spaces where cars can move freely and at high speed without a lot of interference from other uses is really the underpinning to the development of the freeway. And so we start to see in the early 1900s precursors to freeways, where you've got separation between maybe free flowing traffic that's actually going over another street. This is called grade separation, which is a really sort of core tenet of modern freeway development, where you're improving mobility by reducing accessibility, by making this place a place that can't be accessed by local streets that are running perpendicular to it. And then, separating off, train tracks and then having walking paths that are separate so that you don't have pedestrian interference with high-speed car movement on these dedicated lanes. Development of freeways and interstates in the United States was largely inspired by the development of high-speed highways in Italy and Germany. Nazi Germany had actually developed the Autobahn as a way of moving troops really quickly around Germany. And by contrast, the army in the U.S. didn't have a good way of moving supplies and troops from one place to another. There's a famous example of a transcontinental trip that General Eisenhower, who later became President Eisenhower, had made across the U.S. in 1909. And it took them 62 days to get from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And I encourage you to check out some of the videos on YouTube of this transcontinental trip. You can see U.S. troops and vehicles getting stuck on bridges that are collapsing and muddy roads. It was just really difficult to move lots of materials and troops. And this became really a national security and strategic problem with the First and then the Second World War. So President Eisenhower made it a real priority to build a high-speed highway network within the U.S. that was comparable to the one being developed in Germany. So the original plan for the interstate system was this grid of high-speed highways that would cover pretty much the entire U.S. And this was conceived as a network for improving mobility between cities. And that's an important point. Originally, interstates were not really designed for travel within urban regions. They were designed for travel between urban regions. But of course, we've seen that they've also become incredibly important for commuting patterns and movement of goods within cities. But the original system was designed primarily for long distance movement. And this interstate system, which we now call the Eisenhower Interstate System, it also led some really substantial changes in how we finance and plan and design for transportation in the modern era. So the interstate system was, for the first time, financed primarily by the national government instead of local or state governments. And it was financed by user fees, but instead of a toll, those fees were collected through a gas tax. And so in theory, if you were driving, then you would be buying gas. And then the tax on that gas would be used to pay for the road infrastructure that you were driving on. There was a federal match system that was set up to pay for the development of the interstate system, whereby the federal government would pay 90% of the cost and 10% would be covered by state and local governments. And this concept of the federal government providing the bulk of funding for really large-scale transportation projects has continued today, and we'll talk about that more in a future module. This system really embraced the concept of maximizing speeds, maximizing mobility by limiting access. It really embraced the concept of, taking the bulk of movement and moving it onto grade-separated throughways that were not accessible from local streets, so there would be only limited ways of getting on, and this would maximize the speed and volume of traffic, and it would also have some important benefits for safety because it would really minimize the number of conflict points. And then finally, the interstate system really reinforced how the transportation system in our country was an economic engine. So while it was motivated, at least initially, by defense interests, its economic role in terms of transportation of goods and long-distance travel became a really central part of the motivation for the development of the interstate system. And as we'll discuss in a later module, really underpins the federal government's interest in supporting the interstate system as a vehicle for interstate commerce. So while the interstate system was initially conceived primarily for providing mobility between cities, it also quickly became clear that high-speed highways were going to be really important for movement within cities. Early plans for freeway systems in cities like Los Angeles imagined a grid of high-speed highways that were sort of suspended above the local street grid and would allow for high-speed movement from one side of what were then, because of the streetcars, already sprawling urban regions. So it would really benefit to be able to move quickly from one side of them to the other. And Los Angeles has nowadays a freeway system that in many ways reflects this early plan. But building freeways in urban contexts also posed some really serious challenges. Freeways require a lot of space, and in many cases, very large swaths of land were essentially bulldozed in order to make way for freeway development. This is a photo from New York, the Cross Bronx Expressway, which was notoriously developed by a city official in that region called Robert Moses, who had a vision of freeways not only as conduits for improving mobility, but also for affecting some really substantial social change in the New York region. He thought of these large projects as a way to clear slums and actually directed freeways straight through disadvantaged neighborhoods, essentially as an excuse to remove large swaths of the urban landscape and make way for what he considered a more worthy use of that space. A very famous quote of his says that, quote, "When you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat cleaver," end quote. This is how he was notorious for approaching the development of freeways. And in our next video, we'll talk about the emergence of a lot of resistance to this approach to building freeways in urban places.